Chapter 3 Dreams of Auroville. During the first months after returning from my visit with Anastasía, I set about making an intensive search and study of any information about eco-communities I could lay my hands on. Most of my sources told about experiments abroad. Altogether, I've collected information on 86 communities in 19 countries: Belgium, Canada, Denmark, England, France, Germany, India, and others. But I wasn't particularly struck by any of the reports that I had collected. No country could boast any kind of large-scale eco-movement, nor did I come across any communities capable of exercising a significant influence on the social situation in their respective countries. One of the largest and best-known communities that came to my notice is located in India. It goes by the name of Auroville. I'd like to elaborate a little on this one. Auroville was initiated in 1968 by the wife of the founder of the integral yoga movement, Sri Aurobindo Megré. It was thought that the community, once begun, would eventually grow into a thriving city of 50,000 on lands allocated by the Indian government near Pondicherry, where Sri Aurobindo Ashram, a center for integral yoga adherents, had been operating since the 1940s. Auroville, or the City of Dawn, was supposed to embody the idea of unity of people united by a common goal of building a harmonious material world in which no way would find itself at odds with the world of the spirit. The community's charter, written by Megré, states, Auroville will be a site of material and spiritual researches for a living embodiment of an actual human unity. The idea of building a city wherein people will live in harmony with the world of nature, in the harmony of the spirit and love, was approved by the Indian government, and personally by Indira Gandhi, as well as by UNESCO. It received financial support from the Indian government along with a large number of sponsors. Representatives of 121 nations and 23 Indian states attended the opening ceremonies, after which this splendid city, no doubt the dream of a lot of people the world over who call themselves spiritual, began to take shape. However, following the death of Megré in 1973, one of Aurobindo's disciples by the name of Satprem spoke out strongly against the Auroville community, calling it nothing but a commercial enterprise. Sri Aurobindo's ashram, which controlled most of the enterprise's finances, claimed authority over everything going on in the city. But the residents considered that their community belonged to the whole world and was not under the ashram's jurisdiction. The serious confrontation ensued between the spiritual leaders on both sides, a confrontation which was not confined to the ideological level but became more and more physical. In 1980, the Indian government was obliged to pass a decree removing Auroville from the control of Sri Aurobindo's society, and a permanent police detachment was assigned to the community. The Auroville situation led to a general crisis in Sri Aurobindo's movement and teachings. Today, Auroville has about 1,200 residents, instead of the 50,000 or more envisaged by its initiators. The whole region, including the local population, comprises 13 villages and 30,000 people. Quite possibly the downfall of the Auroville's dream was precipitated by the following situation. While any resident may obtain permission to buy land and build himself a house at his own expense, legal title to the land on which the house stands belongs to the city. Thus, it turns out that full confidence is placed in Auroville as a city, but it is not accorded any of its individual residents. Every resident lives in a state of dependency on the community as a whole, and yet the whole project was worked out by people who considered themselves highly spiritual. It seems that in the case of spirituality, there is another side of the coin to be considered. I am extremely disturbed and upset by the situation of Auroville today. While it has not provoked any doubts about Anastasia's project, I cannot say my mind is entirely free from negative thoughts. If things did not work out with a model community in India, a country considered practically the leader in the spiritual understanding of human existence, especially with the financial backing of the Indian government, UNESCO, and sponsors from a variety of countries, then how can Anastasia possibly foresee on her own all the pitfalls that lie ahead? Even if it isn't all on her own, and the masses of readers sharing her views try to make calculations, think everything through, and foresee the future, even then there is no guarantee such concerted efforts will succeed, as nobody has any experience along this line. If anyone knew where to find the foundation on which to build a happy life for both the individual and society as a whole, a happy society would have probably been built somewhere. But it doesn't exist anywhere in the world. The only experience we have is negative. Where can one find anything positive? In Russia, replied Anastasia. Chapter 4. Harbingers of a New Civilization. The first shoots of a new and splendid future are to be found in the Russian Dachniks. These words sounded within me, all by themselves. Anastasia was not around at the time. It took but a moment to recall the enthusiasm and joy with which she talked to me about the Russian Dachniks 4 years ago. She believes that it was thanks to the Dachniks that a global catastrophe on the earth was avoided in 1992. So it turns out that it was in Russia that this amazing movement began, a movement which has had a kindly influence on a part of the earth. I remember her telling me. Millions of pairs of human hands began touching the earth with love. With their hands, you understand, not a bunch of mechanical contraptions. Russians touched the ground caressingly on these little dacha plots, and the earth felt the touch of each individual hand. The earth may be big, but it is very, very sensitive, and the earth found the strength within itself to carry on. Back then, 4 years ago, I didn't take this saying seriously, but now, after learning all of the various attempts by people of different countries and of the world to create spiritual ecological communities, I suddenly realized something. With no noisy fanfare, appeals, advertising, or pompous ceremonies, the most massive scale project has come to fruition right here in Russia. A project having significance for all humanity. When seen against the backdrop of all the various Russian dacha communities, all the reports from various countries on the creation of eco-communities, their sound quite ludicrous. Judge for yourself. Here, spread out in front of me, is a pile of articles and collections of reports seriously discussing the question of how many people should live in an eco-community. A population of no more than 150 is advised. Considerable attention is paid to the governing bodies of such communities and their spiritual leadership. But Russia's dacha cooperatives have existed for years, sometimes comprising 300 families or more. Each cooperative is managed by 1 or 2 people, usually somebody retired from their regular job. In fact, you can call the chairman of a Russia dacha cooperative a manager. He's actually more like a registrar, or a manager who simply carries out the will of the majority. Russia does not have any centralized management system for its dacha movement. However, according to data published by Goskomstat, the State Statistics Committee, in 1997, 14.7 million families had fruit-growing plots, while 7.6 million had vegetable plots. The overall land area cultivated by these families amounted to 1,821,000 hectares. These households independently grew 90% of Russia's potatoes, 77% of its berries and fruit, and 73% of its vegetables. No doubt the theoreticians who have been designing eco-communities and eco-villages for years will protest that a dacha cooperative is not the same as an eco-community. To which I wish to immediately respond. It is not the name but the content that is important. The overwhelming majority of Russia's dacha cooperatives conform to eco-community guidelines. Not only that, with no thunderous declarations on spiritual self-improvement and the necessity of a careful approach to nature, the dachniks have proved their spiritual growth not by words, but by their way of life. They have planted millions of trees. It is thanks to their labors on hundreds of thousands of hectares thought to be infertile and good for nothing, so-called marginal lands, that orchards are now flourishing. We keep hearing how in Russia part of the population is on the verge of starvation. We see strikes by teachers, then by miners, and our politicians are scratching their heads in attempts to bring the country out of crisis after crisis. More than once during Perestroika period of Russia was but a hair's breadth away from a massive social upheaval. But it didn't happen. And now let's try mentally deducting from just the past few years of our lives the 90% of potatoes, 77% of berries, and 73% of vegetable production, and substitute a heightened anxiety level on the part of millions of people. This you would have to do if you were going to exclude from the past few years the calming effect of the dachas. You don't have to be a psychologist to see how dachniks are calmed by their contact with the vegetable plots they have planted. So, if we take away that factor, what would we have been left with in 1992, 1994, or 1997? In any of those years, a colossal social upheaval could have come about. What kind of result might such an upheaval have led to on a planet chock full of deadly weapons? But no catastrophe occurred. Anastasía maintains that in 1992 a catastrophe on a global scale was avoided thanks only to Russia's dachniks. And now, having read all the reports explaining the situation, I tend to agree with her. It's not so important anymore to know just which smarthead in our nation's government came up with the idea of giving the green light to the dacha movement. In Russia, still the Soviet Union back then, or maybe it was Providence itself that saw fit to accord this privilege specifically to Russia. What's important now is that the movement exists, and it's proof positive that there is indeed a possibility of achieving stability in human society. Maybe even that stability so many peoples on various continents have been trying without success to achieve for thousands of years. Anastasía says that the dacha movement in Russia represents a momentous turning point in the development of the human commonwealth. Dachniks are the harbingers of a splendid future which will come after them, she has said, thinking of the future communities she has sketched out. And I myself would very much like to live in one of these splendid communities, a community located in a flourishing country whose name just happens to be Russia. Chapter 5. A Search for Evidence. Russia of the future, a splendid land in which many of today's generations will be able to live a happier life. Russia of the future, a land which will lead the human commonwealth of the whole planet to a happier life. I have seen this splendid country coming into bloom. She, Anastasía, showed me the future of our country, and it is absolutely unimportant and insignificant just how this fiery, untiring recluse living alone in the Siberian taiga is able to travel to other planets, or into the future, or into the past, or by what means or unseen threads she brings together the hearts of people living in different countries into a single, exciting, creative impulse. What is important is that this impulse exists. Does it really matter where she obtained such a colossal amount of all kinds of information and knowledge of our life? What matters immeasurably more is the result of this knowledge. The fact that people living in different cities, once put in touch with the information she possesses, are now planting cedars, that people have started producing cedar nut oil, and that more and more songs and poems about what is beautiful in life are coming to light. This is simply amazing. She dreams about something. I write about it, and presto, it turns into reality, like a kind of fantasy. Yet this fantasy, after all, is embodied in real life for everyone to see. Now she has dreamt about a splendid country. Shall not that too come to pass? Of course it must, and we must help in any way we can. Going over in my mind and analyzing everything Anastasía has said or showed has only made me more and more convinced of the reality of a splendid future. I believe in it. Even though I had begun to believe all Anastasía's words, there was still no way I could put together and publish a chapter on the future of Russia. It wasn't included in the previous book, Co-Creation, and the release of this present volume has been delayed more than once for the same reason. I wanted everything I wrote to look sufficiently real and convincing, so that not just I, but a whole lot of people could believe and set things in motion to create a splendid future. But there are certain sayings of Anastasía's that have prevented me from being less than fully convincing. In Co-Creation, I published Anastasía's statement that what our whole natural environment comprises is precisely the materialized thoughts of God. If man is able to comprehend these, even in part, he will not need to spend so much effort in his search for food, fertilizing the ground, since the ground itself is capable of reestablishing its own fertility, or to waste energy on trying to fight noxious pests and weeds. His thought will be liberated from the problems of everyday living, and man will be able to get involved in tasks more suited to his existence, the co-creation, with God, of splendid worlds. I wanted her words, to be believed by a majority of people. But how can people trust her if even the whole agriculture industry, both in Russia and abroad, cannot dispense with the fertilizing process? So many factors in various countries of the world are involved in the production of all sorts of chemicals for enriching the soil. On a number of occasions, I have put this question to various agricultural scientists, but each time I've got pretty much the same condescending reply. Namely, that, of course, one could set up a paradise garden on a single hectare of land, but you would need to tend this garden from morning till night, and you could not possibly expect a good harvest unless you added fertilizers to the soil, made use of toxic chemicals, otherwise your harvest would be ruined by a whole bunch of pests. When I brought up Anastasía's argument that everything grows in the taiga without human assistance, the scientist countered, "Let's assume it grows, but if your recluse is to be believed, the taiga has been programmed directly by God. Man needs a lot more than what can grow in the taiga. For example, the taiga doesn't have any fruit orchards. That's because orchards need to be cared for by man. They can't grow all by themselves. I've made several visits to such stores as Everything for Your Garden, The Gardener, The Dachnik, and seen so many people buying different bags of chemicals. I watched these people and thought that they'll never believe what Anastasía says, and so there's no point in writing about the future of Russia. They simply won't believe in it. They won't believe in it because this future is first and foremost linked to a new conscious awareness, a different attitude to Earth and our environment. But there is not a single person today who could confirm what she said, not a single real-life example bearing out her words. On the contrary, everything contradicts her position, and the factories producing toxic pesticides continue to operate. There is a whole chain of stores selling fertilizers and chemicals, and a great many people are involved in agricultural research. The absence of significant evidence to back up Anastasía's statements had such a strong effect on me that I came to the point where I was no longer able to write anything at all. It was for that reason that I accepted an invitation to go to Innsbruck in Austria. A German publisher rang me and said that the director of a bioenergy institute by the name of Leonid had invited me to speak on Anastasía at a gathering of the most prominent healers of Europe. The institute would pay me for my travel and lodging expenses, and was prepared to pay me 1,000 marks for every hour I spoke. I didn't go on account of the money, but in search of convincing arguments that a lot of people could understand, either for or against Anastasía's plan. Her affirmations about the future of Russia. Dr. Hoschenig, who invited me to speak to the healers, was himself a professional doctor and a prominent healer, as his father and grandfather had been before him. His grandfather had treated the Japanese imperial family and many other highly placed dignitaries. His personal domains, apart from the Institute building, included several small, cozy hotels where a great number of patients coming from European countries stayed, along with a restaurant, a park, and some other buildings in the city center. He was a millionaire, though, in contrast to the image many Russians have about the lifestyles of a Western millionaire. Leonid, as I found out, handles all the serious work involved in people's treatment himself. He personally treats everyone coming to see him, which can mean as many as 50 patients a day. Indeed, his working day can sometimes stretch to 16 hours. Only occasionally he has entrusted his consultation task to a healer from Russia. I spoke to the gathering of healers at Innsbruck, aware that they were interested first and foremost in Anastasía. I devoted the larger part of my presentation to her and ended up talking a little about her project, with the secret hope that the audience would either confirm or discredit her ideas on the future of Russia. But they neither confirmed nor discredited them. They just kept constantly asking for more details. That evening, Hoschenig threw a banquet in his restaurant. I would simply have called it a supper. Even though everyone could order what they liked, they were all modest, giving preference to the salads. Nobody drank alcohol or smoked. I, too, refrained from ordering any alcoholic beverages. Not because I was afraid of looking like a proverbial black sheep in their eyes. It was just that for some reason I didn't feel like having meat or alcoholic drinks. At the supper table, the talk again returned to Anastasía. A saying was born, though I don't remember who said it first. The splendid future of Russia is linked with the Siberian Anastasía. The phrase caught on, and was in time repeated with various interpretations by healers from Italy, Germany, France, and other countries. I was waiting for specifics as to why and by what means the splendid scenario of the future would unfold, but nobody could offer any specific evidence. The healers were relying on some kind of intuition, whereas I needed proof. Can the earth feed man without a special effort on his part? Simply by virtue of man correctly understanding the thought of a God whom nobody could see? After returning to Russia, I recalled the words of the European healers and continued my search for concrete evidence, for which I was prepared to travel anywhere. But I didn't have to travel very far. An extraordinary coincidence, as though deliberately set up by someone, not only offered theoretical evidence, but proved to be a real and living confirmation of Anastasia's words. It happened this way. Chapter 6. A Garden for Eternity. I set off on a day trip to the country along with employees of the Anastasía Cultural Foundation of Vladimir. We stopped by the picturesque shore of a small pond. The women went about preparing a variety of salads for lunch, while the men attended to building a fire. I stood at the edge of the pond, gazing at the water, and lost myself in thought. I was in a pretty gloomy mood. All at once, Veronica, a resident of a nearby village, came up to me and said, "Vladimir Nikolaevich, just about 7 kilometers from here, in the middle of these fields, there are 2 former manorial estates. There's nothing left of the buildings, but the fruit orchards have been preserved. Nobody looks after them, but they are still bringing forth fruit year after year. They give a lot more fruit than the village orchards, which are tended to and fertilized." In 1976, there was an extremely cold winter in these parts, and a lot of people lost their orchards and were forced to plant new ones. But these two, out among the fields, weren't touched by the cold at all, and not a single tree was lost. Why didn't the cold touch them, I asked. Maybe they were a special variety, cold-resistant. Just the usual variety, but the way everything was set up on these former estates, the way they did it on a single hectare of land, wow! It's pretty much the way Anastasía describes it in your books. 200 years ago, people planted Siberian cedars all around it with the local oak trees. Another thing, the hay from the grass that grows there is a lot richer. It keeps for a long time. If you like, we could go see the place right now. It's just a dirt trail through the fields, but your jeep can make it. I couldn't believe my ears. Who? How? A gift like this, and just at the right place and at the right time. Are such coincidences really coincidental after all? Let's go, I said. The trail ran across fields belonging to a former state farm. I said fields, though they were really more like hayfields or meadows, all overgrown with tall grasses. They've really cut back their growing areas here, observed Evgeny, Veronica's husband. The farm company doesn't have enough money for fertilizer. Anyway, the ground's getting a rest. And not just the ground. The birds have started singing again this year. You didn't hear such happy twittering before. What are they so happy about? Maybe because there are no chemicals on the fields now. Before the revolution, there were villages here in these meadows. My grandmother told me about them, but there's no trace left of them now. Look, there it is, to the right of the trail, a former estate. In the distance, I could see tall trees growing densely together. They appeared to cover about a hectare of ground. This place seemed simply like a green aisle of forest, all surrounded by fields and meadows. As we drew closer, I could see in amongst the dense grove of 200-year-old oak trees and bushes an entrance leading to a woodland oasis inside. We went in through the entrance, and there we were inside. Just imagine, there inside were ancient apple trees with gnarled trunks spreading their branches out into space. Branches literally dripping with fruit. They hadn't been dug around. They were just growing there amidst the grasses. They hadn't been sprayed for insects, but these old apple trees were bearing fruit, and their fruit showed no sign of worm infestation. Some of the trees were real oldies. Their branches were breaking under the weight of the fruit. Real oldies. Quite possibly this was their last year for bearing fruit. They will soon die off, but alongside each ancient tree you could see already shoots of a new tree breaking through the soil. The thought actually came to me that these trees probably wouldn't die, at least not until they saw the fresh and healthy shoots coming from their seed. I walked through the orchard, took a taste of the fruit, wandered among the oak trees growing all around, and it seemed as though I could discern the actual thoughts of the man who had created this splendid oasis. It was as though I could hear him thinking, "Right here, around the orchard, I should put an oak grove. It will protect the orchard from the winter cold, as well as from the summer heat and dry years. Birds will make their nests in the tall trees and stop the caterpillars from taking over. I'll plant a shady oak alley by the shore of the pond. When the trees grow up, their tops will come together, giving shade to the spacious alley below." And all at once, a kind of vague thought made my blood course faster through my veins. What was it demanding of me, this thought? And then it came in a flash. Of course, Anastasía. Naturally, you were right when you said that we could feel God in coming into contact with His creations and continuing His creations. Not by wild antics, jumping up and down, and newfangled rituals, but by directly turning to Him, to His thoughts. It is surely possible to understand His wishes and our own purpose in life. Here I am, standing beneath the oak trees on the shore of a man-made pond, and I can literally read the thoughts of the man behind this living creation. And he, this man, this Russian, who lived here 200 years ago, no doubt felt more than others about the thoughts of the Creator, which enabled him to bring about this paradise creation. His own garden, his own family nest. He may have died, this Russian, but his orchard has remained and is still bringing forth fruit and feeding the children of the neighboring villages, who come here every autumn to delight in the fruits. Some people gather them up and sell them, and you, my fine Russian fellow, no doubt wanted your grandchildren and great-grandchildren to live here. Of course you did. I can tell that because you didn't put up just a mansion with a limited lifespan, but something that will last for eternity. But where are your grandchildren and great-grandchildren today? Your family domain has been abandoned. It's all grown over with grasses, and your pond is drying up. But your alley, for some reason, didn't get overgrown with wild grasses. In fact, the grass beneath it is like a carpet. Your corner of paradise, which you created, your family domain, is no doubt still awaiting the return of your descendants. Decades go by, even centuries, but it is still waiting. So where are they? Who are they now? Whom do they serve? Whom do they worship? Who chased them away from here? We did have a revolution. Maybe that's to blame for everything. Of course it is. Only a revolution is made by people when some sort of qualitative change takes place in the consciousness of the majority. What happened in the minds of your contemporaries, my fine Russian fellow, that your family domain has gone to waste? The local old-timers told me how the aging Russian landowner headed off a bloodbath on his domain. When a group of revolutionary-inclined residents from 2 nearby villages, pumped up on local beer, marched en masse to pillage his family domain, the old landowner came out to meet them with a basket of apples, only to be slain by a bullet from the double-barreled gun. He had known already the night before that they were planning to pillage his house, and he had persuaded his grandson, a Russian officer, to leave the domain. The grandson, a front-line veteran decorated with St. George's Cross, fled together with his comrades in arms with the front-line Mosin rifle slung over their shoulders. Their open wagon also carried a trusty, battle-worn machine gun. He probably went into emigration and now has grandchildren of his own growing up. Your descendants, my fine Russian fellow, are growing up in another land. While in Russia, in your kin's domain, the leaves of the trees in your orchard are rustling in the breeze, and every year your old apple trees are bringing forth fruit, astounding all the residents around with a luxuriant harvest. There isn't even a trace of your house left. All the outbuildings have been torn down, but the orchard lives on in spite of everything, no doubt in the hope that your descendants will return to taste the best apples in the whole wide world. Yet your descendants are still not coming. Why have things turned out like this, and who is making us seek our own happiness at the expense of others just like us? Who is making us breathe air filled with noxious gases and dust instead of floral pollen and beneficial ethers? Who is making us drink water deadened by gases? Who? Who are we today? Why do not your descendants come back, my fine Russian fellow, back to their family nest? In the second domain, the apples were even tastier than in the first. Around this orchard had been planted beautiful Siberian cedars. Local residents informed me that there had even been more cedars earlier. Now only 23 of them were left. During the days following the revolution, when they still had a day labor system, they said people were paid for their work with cedar nuts. Now the nuts were there to be collected by anybody who wanted to. The only thing was, sometimes they would beat the trees very hard with logs to make the cones fall to the ground. 23 Siberian cedars, planted by the hand of man 200 years ago, still stood there all in a row, like soldiers protecting this splendid orchard from the freezing winds and harmful pests. There had been more of them, but one by one they perished, since in the Siberia the cedars were always surrounded by tall pines. A single cedar by itself could not withstand the blasts of winds, as its root system is not all that extensive. Cedars are nourished not only through their roots, but also absorb the surrounding space through their tops. That is why the pines or young cedars protect them, whereas here the cedars were all standing in a row. They lasted the first 150 years, but then, after their tops expanded, they began falling, one after the other. For the past 50 years, nobody thought of planting pines or birches besides them, and so the cedars were left to defend the orchards, standing up against the angry winds all on their own. It was probably just last year that one of them began falling, but came to rest against the top of one next to it in the row. I looked at the sharply leaning tree trunk whose top was intertwined with that of its neighbor. Their branches had grown together, and the falling tree was still living. Both trees were green and bearing seed. There were only 23 left. They're still standing there, supporting each other, bearing seed and protecting the orchard. Oh, you Siberiaks, hang in there just a little longer, please. I'm going to write about you. Oh, Anastasía, you taught me how to write books, but why didn't you teach me how to write words that would be understandable to a lot of people right off the bat? To a whole lot of people. Why can't I manage to write in an understandable way for a great many people? Why does my thought get confused? Why do the cedars fall, and people not far from these former domains which have preserved right up to our day their splendid orchards and shady alleys, are located several villages. The sight of these villages spoils the whole surrounding landscape. If you look at them from afar, you get the impression that some sort of worm ran amok, laid everything waste, and dug up the flower-covered meadows. Slums full of gray village houses, farm buildings thrown together out of various rotting materials, dirt from roads broken down under the wheels of lorries and tractors, all contribute to this impression. I asked the local residents whether they had been to the orchards laid out among the cedar and oak trees. Many had been there, tasted the apples. Young people were accustomed to going to the place for picnics. It's lovely there, was chorused by young and old alike. But when I asked why nobody had tried to set up their own homestead in the same image and likeness, I got pretty much the same answer each time. We don't have the kind of money the landowners who created this beauty had. Older residents said that the cedar saplings had been brought here by the landowner directly from Siberia. When I asked how much it cost just to take a cedar nut from one of these trees and plant it in the ground, I got a strained silence in reply. Which brings me to the thought that it is not the lack of opportunity or financial means, but our own inner coding that is somehow to blame for all our woes. Nowadays, people with money are putting up a lot of fancy houses in the country. The land around these houses has been either dug up or buried in asphalt. In 20 or 30 years, these houses are going to be in need of repair. They won't look like new anymore, and their children won't need this old derelict. They won't be needing a family domain, a motherland, like that, and so they'll go off and find themselves a new one. But they'll be taking with them the same mysterious coding they got from their parents, and repeating their life as temporary caretakers on the land, instead of creating something for eternity. Who will be able to remove it, and how, this mysterious coding for hopelessness? Perhaps what Anastasía has said and shown about the future of Russia will somehow help us in this regard. And just to allay the doubts of the skeptics, I have put on the inside covers of this book photographs of these amazing Russian orchards, spreading out their fruit-laden branches to the Russia of the future.